I was in ABF convention last year at Disneyland, and I happened to be in on his talk, and it was really inspiring, really good. So when I thought of who I wanted to have at this event, I said, you know what, I think I'm going to give him a call. And he ended up coming. So I want to introduce Jim Frasier. Please give him a hand. Jim is a professor at Penn State University. He spent the last 8 years concentrating on the impacts of pesticides on honeybees. He has served on the USDA, APHIS EPA National Stakeholder Conference on Bee Health 2011, the Pelson Conference on Pollinator Risk Assessment 2010, and has been science advisor to the National Honeybee Advisory Board since 2009. Dr. Frasier recently received the Friend of the Industry Award from the National Honey Producers Association 2014 and the President's Award and Hoopengarner Award from the National Beekeeping Federation 2015. Jim Frasier. Sit here or not.
Well, good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, especially since I found out Tom Seeley was your speaker last year. Tom was one of my heroes, really an excellent researcher. And unlike Tom, I'm not a career-long bee scientist. I've only been concentrating on bees for about the last 8 years. And it's really the consequence of my wife, Marianne Frasier, being the honeybee extension person in Pennsylvania. And when colony collapse disorder hit, she was at the forefront of that, dealing with our beekeepers. And we have an hour commute back and forth from home to the campus. And every day we talk about the bee situation. And I'd say, why are you doing that? Why aren't you doing this? And she said, well, why don't you get involved? And so this is the rest of the story. I wrote this talk for the ABF meeting in January with the idea that it was probably going to be my last professional talk. And I wanted it to be meaningful, and I wanted it to have real impact for beekeepers. Because being the science advisor for the National Honeybee Advisory Board for the last several years has really given me exposure to some of the largest beekeepers in the country. I've gained a great deal of respect for what they do as not only beekeepers but as businessmen and women. And I really think that the perspective that I want to give to you today has some important consequences for your future. This is our team in the lab at Penn State, and I give this talk on behalf of Chris Mullen, our toxicologist, and my wife Marianne, who's our senior extension associate. All of the other people in this meeting have come and gone from our lab in the meantime, but I'm going to reference some of their work in my talk today. Jing Chen on the front left was a PhD chemist who came to us as a postdoc because her husband was a chemist in the chemistry department. Turned out she's an expert in LC mass spec and really got our new mass spec to do things we didn't even know was possible. Wanyi Zhu next to her got her PhD with us and has developed the insect modeling and some of the larval feeding studies I'll reference. Tim Carlo got his master's degree with us and went on to the Navy. Stephanie and Sarah were two really excellent technicians in the lab. And Dan Schmiel on the upper right got his PhD with us, then went to Jamie Ellis for a postdoc that is now at the Bayer Bee Health Center in North Carolina. Well, this talk came from having read Jonathan Cahn's The Harbinger, talking about the events around 9/11 with respect to the biblical proportions of the end times. And the fact that 2015 and 2014 and 2015 were one of those rare periods where there are two double blood moons, so a tetrad of blood moons, which has a relatively rare occurrence, signaling perhaps significant things for the end times. And so I thought of this particular title of Dying Bees, Harbingers of the End Times or Opportunities Buzzing. And so I want to give you a little background on myself because the perspective that I bring is really a lifelong perspective. I grew up in Ohio in dairy farming country, about an hour's drive south of Cleveland, but at the time it was a dairy farming country in Ohio, a small town of about 1,100 people. My father was in the plumbing and heating business for himself, and so I grew up doing a lot of work on farms, but didn't actually live on a farm. I've spent 45 years as an agricultural scientist. I did my undergraduate and graduate work at Ohio State. It was a great teaching entomology department at the time. I went from there to Mississippi State as assistant professor, went through the academic ranks, went from there to the DuPont company as a senior scientist, and then a research associate, and from there back to Penn State as head of the department. So I'm one of the very few academic scientists who's been both in academics and in industry, and then back to academics. And so I had an opportunity to sort of do a reality check on how that industry experience really influenced my perspective on life. During my career, I've seen three major developments in the science of entomology. The first was the birth of integrated pest management, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Secondly, the generation of the field of chemical ecology, which really started in entomology around the understanding the chemical senses of insects, and that was my specialty area before I worked on bees, and how the chemicals in plants and insects are the basis for communication, and in fact the basic organization of most biological systems, and continues to flourish to this day. And then finally, while I was at DuPont, we hired a whole building full of molecular biologists, and so I've experienced the molecular revolution and some of the consequences of that resulting in genetically modified organisms. I've also learned along the way that those who do not learn from history are bound to repeat its mistakes. And so I want to talk about that today. And I've also learned that DuPont, there are three questions one can ask about understanding how well is an organization or a system working. First one is, what's important around here? Second one, how well are we doing? And the third one is, how do we know how well we're doing? And if you ask those three questions of all the individuals in an organization, you can very quickly find out what kind of communication is going on, where the buck stops, if people really understand what the company is all about or not. And so we're going to ask those three questions as I go through this today. And I really want to take the topic of our dying bees, harbingers, or an opportunity. And I want to talk about pesticides in the landscape, first of all. Secondly, I want to talk about bees, pesticides in our food system. And thirdly, I want to talk about you as opportunities for agents of change. And I want to do this by informing you of some things, some facts that I've learned working with bees that you may or may not be familiar with. But more importantly, I want to take you from your zone of comfort to a place of discomfort. I want to agitate you with what I talk about today. In fact, if I do it really well, I may make you downright angry about the situation that we have. And hopefully that will cause you to want to do something about it. And I'm going to give you some ideas about how to be empowered as agents of change into the future. There's no doubt that pollinators are in decline in North America and in the world. This National Academy of Sciences study came out in 2007, just about the time that colony collapse disorder was a term that was coined. And it documented that all pollinators in North America are in decline. Likewise, studies in science showed that in the more industrialized countries older than ourselves, both in the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, not only are pollinators in decline, but the plants that require pollinators for their survival are also in decline. And so it's a harbinger of what we can expect to happen here in our country if things don't get better. Well, the first thing I want to do is talk about bees in the landscape. You may or may not be aware of how much bees forage over the landscape. There's been some good talks so far this morning, and we're going to hear some more at this meeting. When a bee is up flying from the colony, it has this kind of perspective of the landscape. But it turns out not all landscapes are the same. And in fact, according to Tom Seeley, honeybees forage an average of about 3.7 miles radius from the colony 95% of the time. That encompasses an area of almost 28,000 acres. How many of you are thinking about what's in the 28,000 acres around where my colonies are located, and what does that mean in terms of exposure to the bees? If they're under stress, that increases to 6.2 miles. And within that foraging, if Tom put out sugar solution of different kinds of rewards at different cardinal directions from the colony, on average within 2 hours, the colony found the most rewarding source and concentrated their foraging. So foraging is not only far-reaching, but it's very dynamic. Turns out, though, that the pesticide landscape depends on where you are. In Europe, in the United Kingdom, there's about 300 registered active ingredient pesticides. In France, it's about 500, and in most European Union countries, it's somewhere between 400 and 500 active ingredients. But in the US of A, it's 1,200 active ingredients, marketed as more than 18,000 products. So given all things else as being equal, where would you rather be a bee? Well, we shocked ourselves, and I think the research world in general, back in 2010 when we first took on the role of wanting to look at pesticides in bee colonies and pollen and nectar and wax. And we were very surprised to find up to 39 different pesticides in a single wax sample, up to 31 different pesticides in pollen, and an average of 6 different pesticides in each pollen sample coming back. We looked at something like 171 different pesticides, found 131 of these. And the interesting thing about this study was that it was the result of doing analysis on samples that came in for, first of all, studies about whether colonies were collapsing or not collapsing, or studies in our apple orchard, or samples from beekeepers who were curious about whether there was pesticides in their bees. This data set of over 1,000 samples that have been analyzed was not the result of a systematic survey of any kind. People cite this. It's been referenced read by more than 70,000 people since this paper was published. And everyone that talks about pesticides cites this paper as evidence of how frequent and how many pesticides are found in a honeybee colony. And yet it really does not give us a true picture of what's happening across the United States or in any given state. It simply says that pesticides are there in large numbers. They're very frequently found. A lot of these are systemics. And the really important thing is that it's always a mixture of all different kinds of insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, miticides mixed together. And the upshot of that is there is no toxicological literature on what these combinations might represent. Well, we've studied extensively field studies in apple orchards in Adams County, Pennsylvania. This is the area just north of Gettysburg. It's a beautiful rolling countryside. And in early spring, it's covered with tree fruits, mostly apples, but peaches, pears, and plums. And so this is a typical view when apples come into bloom. And they're about 10% king bloom is when bees are put in for pollination. And so we took advantage of the fact that there had been a 6-year study here where conventional insecticide treatments in apples were paired with low-risk pesticides, including neonicotinoids. And so we had a number of growers who were cooperating with researchers. We knew the pesticide history of these orchards, and we chose these as a place to look at what these impacts might be on bee colonies. Here's just one data slide that I want to use to illustrate some of what we found in multiple years of these studies. You see there's pre-bloom applications of one neonicotinoid and several fungicides, and they're listed under the reduced risk block and also under the conventional block. These blocks of orchard were at least 5 acres in size, and you can see what was applied there. And then we sampled the bee bread from 3 different colonies in each of these blocks, as well as pollen from a solitary bee, Osmia cornifron, that was in tubes that we also put into the orchard. And we did this because Osmia is a very efficient apple pollinator, but it does not fly nearly as far as honeybees do. So we were thinking about using this as an internal control. And what you can see there is that what we found in each of the colonies is a reflection of the neonicotinoid and the fungicides that were used before bloom in that block, as well as some from the adjoining block. But in addition to that, this bee bread contained 12 other pesticides that were never used in this apple orchard. And in fact, the Osmia did the same thing, and you can see that because they forage probably not as far as honeybees, they have higher concentrations of some of the things which we would predict if they were using more apple pollen than the bees were. But they also had 12 other pesticides in their pollen that were not used in this apple orchard. But then, to our surprise, we found that some of the Osmia had pollen that was contaminated with cumulphos. That cumulphos could only have come from the honeybee colonies. And so it was our first indication that the way these Osmia most likely got that pollen was from pollen from honeybees left on a blossom. And when the Osmia bee comes along, it picks up some of that contaminated pollen and takes it back. And so it was the first indication that goes along with the study that our colleagues Dianne Cox-Foster and others have done to show that viruses are spread through contaminated pollen among the pollinator community, visiting the same blossoms, and we think pesticides are spread the same way. Well, one of the difficulties in trying to quantify what's actually there in terms of pesticides is, well, if their bees are bringing in lots of pesticides that are not in the orchard itself, and we want to quantify what's the exposure from the orchard, we really need to have some measure of how much apple pollen the bees are actually bringing in. And so we looked at the corbicular pollen trapped off the bees in multiple years across multiple colonies from multiple orchards, and you can see that the mean percent apple pollen ranged from 8% to 31%, but the range went from 2% to 61%. It's different for each colony. I was really surprised by this. Maybe you're not as beekeepers, but for me, this was a real eye-opening experience. And so, if we want to quantify how much neonicotinoid is in the pollen coming from apples, and it's being diluted by this pollen coming in from other sources, we'd have to use this multiplication factor of anywhere from 3 to 12 times to really get the concentration coming in from that apple pollen. Well, we've developed a mechanism, I think a good mechanism for doing field studies to try to establish a cause and effect relationship between pesticide exposure and consequence for the colony. And we do this by bringing packaged bees in, setting them up on all new equipment in the spring, letting them develop up, and then take those colonies to different orchards where we have the reduced risk or the conventional blocks. Leave them there for 10 days during the normal pollination time. One of those days we put on a trap and get a sample of the pollen that's coming into those colonies. Then at the end of the 10-day period, we take them out of the colony, out of the orchards, and bring them back to our control apiary at the campus, leave the pollen traps on, and force them to rear a generation of brood on that pollen that was collected while they were in apples. And then we take the emerging bees and evaluate them for longevity and for hyperpharyngal limits. So I don't have time to go through all the data, but I want to give you sort of the bottom line of what we've learned from these studies. First of all, we have this field testing protocol, which the EPA does not have a standard field testing protocol. We think this is a good start on one to really look at the impact of pesticides on a single generation. 1E has developed a new population dynamics model, and I don't have time to go into this, but it's a simulation model that very effectively models the population dynamics of a honeybee colony. There are 3 other places in the country, in the world actually, where this is being done. There's a really good modeling group in Australia. There's one in the European Union that's published a new BEHAVE model. There's a French group that I've just recently found out about. I can't say much about what they're doing. And there's one use model, and we're about to submit this for publication, but we've been able to use the model to do some interesting work. I think it's safe to say that bees collect pesticide residues while pollinating apples that reflect what's used in the orchard, but also contain added pesticides from outside the orchard. So the landscape is what's really important. Mary Ann did another study with some cooperators across the country where we looked at foraging bees doing pollination on various crops and found the same sort of thing, that the bees were gathering pesticides well beyond the crop in which they were placed for pollination. And so the fact that bees are committed to developing a wide variety of pollen, which is referred to as their polylectic nature, is something they do all the time, regardless of where they are. And so that means that the amount of particular pollen coming into a given colony with the amount of nectar is different from one colony to the next, even sitting side by side from one orchard or one location to another. So this polylectic nature is something the bees are genetically adapted to do, and do this under all circumstances. Well, what can we conclude from this? Well, the nurse bees that we reared from one generation of larvae that were reared on this contaminated pollen from a single apple pollination event have their longevity reduced by 50%. They live half as long as normal. And their hyperpharyngeal glands are greatly hypertrophied. We don't know what this means for the colony, but it can't be good. Secondly, if we rear colonies on migratory beekeeper levels of pesticides, which are much higher in general than they are for backyard beekeepers or occasional beekeepers, we can separate these into herbicides alone, or fungicides alone, or pesticides alone, or combinations of those, and we find that there are multiple sublethal impacts on the colonies using methods that are probably a little finer precision than is typically used in standard beekeeping practices. So there are a number of things that happen. And finally, our simulation modeling has given us some surprising results so far. That is that the population dynamics of a colony are impacted by a number of things, but not in the way that you would expect. And in fact, the tendency to think about pesticides as something that's killing bees, and these dead bees, or the inoperative bees, as Judy talked to us this morning about, being the ones that really impact the colony, is not nearly as great as those things that cause a shift in the social structure of the colony. There is so much redundancy in the social organization of the colony, and so much reproductive capacity of the colony, that the amount of mortality that can occur at each different stage can be very large and still not impact the dynamics of the colony in a single year. So our model will show, let us calculate a stable colony over multiple years, or if we vary one factor at a time, what that really does in terms of reducing the colony. Well, how much pesticides are in the landscape? It's amazing to have to say that nobody really knows. There is no monitoring of pesticides in the terrestrial environment that's actually going on. The one place where it's going on is the U.S. Geological Survey's National Water Quality Assessment Program that's been in place for a long time to look at the level of atrazine in surface waters and wells, because this has been such a ubiquitous contaminant in the environment of agricultural use. And so there was a time when nearly all rural wells were contaminated with atrazine. And here is a new website that the USGS put up a little over a year or so ago. And one of the geographic maps down there shows the likelihood that atrazine plus its breakdown product will exceed drinking water standards in shallow groundwater on lying agricultural areas. And on this website, you can look at the calculated usage of pesticides on a county-by-county basis and actually bring this. So it is the most detailed information available on water systems, and from that calculated potential use of the material. Well, during the time I was at DuPont, pyrethroids were really the predominant insecticides in the marketplace, and here's the estimated agricultural use for permethrin in 2011. That's the most recent year that's in this database. And this is shows the geographic distribution of permethrin. And then you can also look at its use on a crop-by-crop basis over the time period. And you can see that in general, the use of pyrethroids has been falling over the last 10-year period or so. The most widely used fungicide in the country is chlorthalonil. And you can see here the estimated distribution for chlorthalonil and its use on crops by year. See, it's mostly on vegetables and fruits. Likewise, the estimated use for chlorothianidin, one of the neonicotinoids that's used in seed treatment. Its distribution, you can see how heavy it is in the Corn Belt. And in fact, here is its anticipated use by year. You can see that the use rate has really gone up in parallel with the increase in treated seeds that have been used mostly in corn and soybeans. And you see the use rate there is about 1.5 million pounds a year. Compare this with glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, which is the most widely used herbicide in the United States. You can see how intense that is. But more importantly, you see that the use is now in terms of 250 million pounds per year in agricultural areas, okay, up to 2011. And there's been a sizable increase since then because of the difficulty with resistance. In addition to these active ingredients in the environment, the USGS has developed some methodology for quantifying mixtures of pesticides in streams and in aquatic habitats. And here's one of the studies that was put out in, I think, 2013, where they sampled 98 samples were evaluated for various kinds of pollutants. Overall samples, 33% were toxic to an aquatic cod, 12% to midges. Bifenthrin exceeded threshold in 14% of the samples. And they had a mean probable effect concentration quotient, which is a way of improving the calculation of mixtures of compounds and their impact on the organism. Likewise, they have continued this, and this watershed regression for pesticides, or WARP model, for predicting stream concentrations of multiple pesticides was published in 2014. And I show this because this model uses the atrazine model plus some adjustments per factor for each pesticide, and allows this to have a calculation where they put 112 pesticides, a model nationwide. 25% of these gave a greater than 50% probability of exceeding the toxic threshold for one or more aquatic species in one or more streams. Many streams in the Corn Belt had one or more pesticides exceeding aquatic life benchmarks, indicating extreme vulnerability here. And this study has now been published this past year, showing that in the Corn Belt, something like 75% of the streams have high levels of neonicotinoids in them. In addition to the active ingredients, Judy did a nice job this morning of talking about formulation ingredients. Formulation ingredients are added to the active ingredient for all sorts of reasons: protect them from ultraviolet breakdown, spreaders, stickers, penetrants, that sort of thing. And the first two on this list are the nonylphenol ethoxylates, or a group of surfactants that are widely used in pesticides and in personal care and home products like shampoo and skin creams and deodorants and things. And you see the average yearly release and transfer rate is 320 million pounds in the United States. The second material on that list, N-methyl-2-pyrrolidone, is the most universal solvent in systemic pesticides. And you see its use rate is 33 million pounds a year. Compared to down the list there, chlorthalonil, the fungicide that we looked at, the most widely used fungicide, had a rate of 274,000. So these formulation ingredients are used in huge amounts. And we've done some initial work to show that these things on their own can be more toxic to honeybees than are the active ingredients. I don't have time to show you all that data. But, summary. It's an amazing statement to make in 2015, but the pesticide residues are largely unknown for most terrestrial environments. We know there's a difference between ag areas and urban areas or forestry areas, but we don't really know what the totals are. Pesticide residues in water systems, in agricultural areas where they've been measured, have significant frequencies above toxic thresholds for aquatic insects, and mixtures are the norm. That's the key thing. Mixtures are there all the time, and yet there's nothing in the risk evaluation process that includes mixtures. I would say it's a fair statement to say that there are many, many unknowns in trying to quantify what the real pesticide exposure is for bees of all types, not just honeybees, but solitary bees as well. And so all studies that are being done are really relevant until we actually know what the true exposure is. And I don't think there's anyone in this room who actually knows the true exposure of neonicotinoids for honeybees or any other bee. I certainly don't know, and we've got a long way to go. Lab studies are a way of measuring the intrinsic action of a compound on a biological system under controlled conditions. It's the most controlled cause and effect kind of experiment we can do. It's the basis for the LD50 value. So we measure the toxicity of a chemical by applying it topically to an insect over different doses and calculate the mortality resulting from that in a specified time period, usually 24 or 48 hours. And that's the acute topical LD50 for that compound, and that's the value that's used to compare toxicity across compounds. That's different from an ingested compound, so the oral LD50 value is going to be very different for a one-day feeding study. Or if you feed it for 10 days, the chronic oral toxicity is going to be even lower. So there are multiple ways of characterizing the toxicity of compounds. And when someone measures under a laboratory situation the impact of a pesticide or a formulation component that interferes with learning or disrupts behavior or alters locomotor function, those are viable biological impacts of that chemical. And it's not really meant to explain what happens in the real world because there's so many other variables that can impact it. But yet it is a true measure of the biological impact of that chemical. And so until we really understand the combinations that are out there and the concentrations that are out there, we have a long way to go to really document what's happening. And finally, I show these examples from the U.S. Geological Survey because they have methodology for dealing with mixtures of chemicals in aquatic environments, very sophisticated ways of handling the data and handling the measurements. And yet the EPA that deals with terrestrial systems refuses to deal with mixtures. They say we can only deal with one chemical at a time, actually one active ingredient at a time, minus the formulation chemicals. It's completely unrealistic, and there's no justification on the basis of science for doing that. Well, how well are we doing in the environment? Well, I'd say that bees as environmental indicators tell us that pesticide mixtures are prevalent in pollen and nectar and therefore in plants of all kinds and therefore in the environment. No pesticide or formulation ingredients or industrial chemicals are being monitored in the terrestrial environment. You are singly gifted here in Pennsylvania to have the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture require pesticide records. This is the only state in the United States where this is being done. It is the one data set that everyone must turn to get any inkling whatsoever of where and when pesticides are used and what the potential impacts might be. The people in Vermont claim their state is small enough that they can understand how much is going on. But in every other state, including Pennsylvania, we haven't a clue. Areas of intensive ag production have the highest environmental loads of pesticides. This is well documented, has been since the 70s or earlier, and the highest human health consequences and the highest bee colony impacts. The environmental toxicologists know the relationship between environmental loads of xenobiotics and decreasing human health. And so the charter for EPA says they have a goal of preventing undue risks from pesticide use. And the societal goals of preventing a degraded environment, which is also EPA's purview, have clearly not been met. And I can't think of a more difficult job in the country than working for EPA with this kind of a requirement to be done and having to make decisions when you don't have all the data necessary. Something scientists avoid like the plague, but if an EPA scientist cannot do that. So I would say that because we don't know what's in the environment, we don't know what mixtures are doing, we don't know anything about formulation ingredients added together, the true disruption of the biological complexities of our environment, whether it's an ag ecosystem or a terrestrial watershed, we really can't say anything realistic about what's actually going on. We're just ignorant of the real facts. So I've put together this conceptual model, which is based on some very real measurements in terms of what I would propose is the likely pyramid of chemical exposure for bees in the United States as well as for ourselves. I said there's 1,300 different active ingredients sold as all these products. We know a little bit about individual pesticides, but we know practically nothing about combinations. We've looked at the most frequently used pesticides and fungicides and their impacts on honeybee larvae. In a carefully controlled laboratory feeding study, we found evidence of synergism, evidence of antagonism among just those 4 chemicals. We found differences in sensitivity between larval honeybees and adult honeybees of over 1,000-fold. We've looked at most commonly used formulated pesticides in apple orchards. We've evaluated in careful laboratory studies on honeybees and on osmia cornifrons. 1,000-fold difference in sensitivity of just those 5 compounds, almost 2 species. We can say nothing about all the other native species of bees that visit apple orchards. But yet we have a true indication that the variability is there. It's time we started dealing with that. In addition to the pesticides and the formulation chemicals, the natural products in pollen and in nectar, when I mention chemical ecology, plants defend themselves on the basis of natural chemicals that they possess, and there's a whole world of literature out there, some of which is beginning to be uncovered about the interactions of these natural products with honeybees. Picomeric acid and abscisic acid, one of the growth hormones in plants, is known to impact bees. And there are many, many others of which most have not been really studied, and they certainly haven't been studied in terms of combinations with pesticides. Last year, there are more than 80,000 industrial chemicals used widely across the United States. 65,000 of these were grandfathered in as not being required to ever be tested. Last year there was a consideration by Congress of giving EPA the charge to test these 65,000 chemicals. That wasn't done, and Congress is still wrestling with how to have these chemicals looked at because none of them have been evaluated for human health. And most recently, Chris just came back from the American Chemical Society meeting this past month, where there was a half-a-day session dealing with pharmaceuticals and personal care products in water systems. Since World War II, all the drugs, pharmaceuticals, and now these same surfactants in shampoos and other personal care products have been passing through our water treatment plants that were never designed to do anything to degrade those chemicals. They've gone through the water treatment plant, they've gone into the effluent that goes into the rivers, into the groundwater, into our environment. How big a problem is this? Well, the indications of the few studies that have been done in the last 10 years are not good. And how big a problem is this? Well, in general, pharmaceuticals or drugs are made to be highly potent, and so they act at very low concentrations on a biological system. Turns out they're also very resilient to environmental degradation. And what I put here is that the United States has 5% of the world's population. We consume 50% of the world's drugs. And we've been doing this for the last 70 years and pumping it into the environment. We're doing this completely ignorant of the consequences. If there's one book that you've never read, I can recommend this. Our Stolen Future is more important, I think, to read than Silent Spring. Theo Colborn and her colleagues from the University of Colorado who wrote this book in the 1990s documented for the first time the scientific understanding that large molecules like DDT, as an example of a pesticide, can rearrange their structure, their configuration in three-dimensional space, and something that was designed like DDT to interact with the sodium channel of a nerve can actually rearrange itself to mimic a human hormone and bind to a human hormone receptor. No one would ever have dreamed this possible until it was documented. And so what this means is that if there's pesticide residue on the food that's being eaten or in the water that's being consumed, that an endocrine disrupting chemical can enter the bloodstream, assume the structure of a hormone and bind to a hormone receptor and cause that hormone signal to be turned on at a very inappropriate time. This is critically important during the development of a human fetus during the 9-month gestation period. And there are documented examples of how disrupting the normal endocrine function can impact the development of a child the rest of its life. And the really big kicker about this is that we are accustomed to talking about pesticides active at parts per billion. But when it's an endocrine disrupting effect, we're talking parts per trillion, 1,000 times lower than pesticides. We're just beginning to measure endocrine disruption in bees and in insects, but we really shouldn't be surprised if it's happening. And so I recommend this website that Theo developed called the Endocrine Disruption Exchange, TEDx. It's a wonderful website. You can go there, you can find the direct access to the scientific literature on this. This has been known for 30 years, and yet only last year was the first potential policy response to this actually made in Washington. You can go to the Endocrine Exchange, you can find out what endocrine disruption is all about. You can look at the prenatal origins of endocrine disruption in humans. You can look at sections on chemicals used in fracking for natural gas, what sort of endocrine disrupting effects they have, and you can look at pesticides as a separate class. Well, in addition to not knowing what's in the environment, let's ask the question about, well, what about our food system? We know that pesticides are an absolutely essential component of managing risk. What do we want from a food system? I think we would all agree on the following list. We want abundant, uncontaminated, nutritious, affordable food of a wide variety. Everybody in the world wants that. We want a production system that is sustainable and in harmony with multiple kinds of environments. It has to be sustainable or it's not going to do us any good in the long term. We want a production system that preserves the biological diversity, the soil productivity, and the water purity of our environment. We have entrusted agricultural producers with major environmental conservation, and they should be recognized and supported for this critical role. We should value what producers do in sustaining the environment above all else. And finally, we should ensure that these producers can have a rewarding and sustainable lifestyle given their critical role in our survival. This has clearly not been the case. The number of dairy farms that have disappeared in Pennsylvania in my lifetime is staggering as a consequence of society not dealing with these values. Well, how well are we doing? Well, since the 1900s, our government policy and the way we conduct ourselves has been driven by the paradigm of the Industrial Revolution. We've made great strides in our economy by valuing the economy of scale of production. Whoever could make the most, the cheapest, won the contract. And that has driven down the price for a lot of things that we use on a daily basis, and seems like the ideal way to do things. So the production of widgets results in a cost-centered, inexpensive way to produce the same thing. What really happens, though, is that ag research focused on the same concept in terms of increasing farm productivity, and it led to an emphasis of farming from fence row to fence row. Everything that couldn't be planted as a crop should be gotten rid of. And once we discovered insecticides during World War II that could be used to kill insects and reduce the risk or eliminate plant diseases, this was seen as an ideal way of managing risk with the least amount of effort. But the problem is that the off-farm consequences of these chemicals in the environment were ignored, largely ignored. The landscape and watershed impacts were completely ignored. The real costs of the environment were not considered. And the environmental conservation roles of farmers and their lifestyles have also been largely ignored as a societal value. Well, what was the consequence of this? How do we know how well we're doing? Well, we've had a shift of the small family farm that was the general farm that had all sorts of things there, could support the living of a given family, to larger farms, more and more acreage in order to make a decent profit, to now factory farms. Economy of scale leads to, inevitably, decreased quality of the product and increased environmental costs, both of which are externalized to the economic calculation of what's going on and largely forgotten. So we always forget about and don't include the impacts on the environment as a real cost. When environmental impacts of the waste disposal extend beyond the borders of a farm, it becomes a community safety issue, not a right to farm issue. And I had an example of this in my own backyard in Pennsylvania. We have a lot of contentious interactions between urban centers and farmland from Lancaster farming throughout Pennsylvania. The state has passed a Right to Farm Act, which prohibits individual boards of supervisors from passing any law that would restrict a farmer from engaging in agricultural practices. Well, if that farmer happens to want to put in a concentrated animal feeding operation with 5,000 hogs, he's going to generate more waste than he can handle on farm, and that's going to have to be distributed across the landscape. In our case, it was distributed across the landscape in our valley that has limestone karst deposit underneath, and so that groundwater is going to contaminate every well and every spring in our valley. It's not a matter of if, but a matter of when. And yet our local board of supervisors were powerless to do anything about that. So once again, a well-intentioned law is having the opposite impact that it should have. I would say that corporate farms that dictate to farmers what they can do and when they can do it and how they can do it really relegates them from independent watchmen of the environment to serf status. And what's even more amazing is that people who do this kind of contract farming assume all the environmental liability for the disposal or operation of that facility using what the corporate directors tell them to do. While grains may rightly be considered as commodities, where we want to produce the largest amount for the cheapest amount of money, the majority of our food doesn't really fit that model of production. Chemically free, nutritious food is not a specialty item. It ought to be the mainstay of what we put in our bodies. Well, there's a model of how to change the system, and the organic growers have been doing this for a long time. They've been paddling upstream against all potential arguments and reason to the contrary. There is an alternative model for food production. Organic farming and even production ag knows how to minimize chemical uses through integrated pest management. I've seen this develop over the course of my career, and I know how effective it can be. There's a major focus on healthy soil equals healthy plants. Healthy plants are more resistant to diseases and more resistant to insect pests. Locally grown and locally consumed food eliminates the energy cost of 2,000 miles of transportation for the average item that's in your supermarket. A high priority for sustainability of the environment and for those engaging and sustaining those who are engaged in food production as part of this organic system. High personal innovation in increasing the efficiency of production, finding new and unique ways to do something more effectively or cheaper, the same sort of thing that beekeepers do every day. And a recent study confirms that the long-held belief that if we switch to organic production, we can't produce as much food as conventional agriculture does, was done by Claire Kremen's group here in California, showing that less than a 10% difference between organic production and conventional production. Well, how well is this alternative model working? Consumers have been voting approval of organic production with their purchases at about a 20% increase every year for the last 20 years. It's what people want. It's the fastest growing sector of most food markets. The country, locally consumed and locally produced. Know your farmer. Organic, sustainable farms are growing rapidly in the East. We have a Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture, PASA it's called, that has been a main catalyst for this kind of growth, for helping educate people who want to produce things, for making chef to farmer connections, for sharing information. We draw at our annual meeting on the Penn State campus over 2,000 people to this meeting every year. And it is the largest sustainable ag organization in the eastern United States. And so the consequence is that the preferred quality of food, the preferred kinds of environmental impacts, and the preferred lifestyles are being produced. There's a very high innovation on new approaches, such things as pasture dairy, grass-fed beef, high tonal season extension, pick your own farms, farm tours, and on and on. People are finding ways to make an entire living on less than 20 acres producing produce and selling it. When I went to Mississippi in 1970, it was an amazing transition in a lot of ways. I grew up in Ohio, never spent any time in the Deep South. I got to Starkville, Mississippi, in the heart of the cotton producing country. And they said, we want to grow cotton, you got to poison them bugs. That's all there is to it. You got to use methylparathione. It was the standard. And in 1970, when I went to Mississippi State as an assistant professor, more than 50% of all the pesticide used in the United States every year was used to grow cotton because of the boll weevil. Well, what happened while I was there was that entomologists said, look, if you go out and can sample a cotton field and measure the number of boll weevils that are there, and we know through our studies and through developing models that happen, what population level at what time of the year will result in damage to the crop, you can delay spraying until the population reaches that economic threshold. And what that resulted in was reducing the number of sprays from 25 to 30 in a season down to 15 or less. The cost savings went in the farmer's pocket. The cost savings went not into the environment, but in non-chemical use. Simulation modeling of crop plants and pest dynamics guided those decisions, and I saw the early efforts at developing simulation modeling. That's where I gained such an appreciation for it. I was there doing the trial boll weevil eradication experiment, where we built a facility at Mississippi State to rear 12 million boll weevils a week, sterilize them with a chemosterilant, and then drop them out of an airplane and flood the natural population with sterile males so that when a female boll weevil mated only once with a sterile male, she was not going to produce viable offspring. We flooded the population as a major population suppression technique. We demonstrated that it would work, and that became the basis for eliminating the boll weevil as a pest of cotton in the continental United States. We started on the East Coast, went all the way across the United States, down into Texas, and down into Mexico, and eliminated the boll weevil. That completely changed cotton production and brought many acres of cotton production back that had been eliminated because of the combination of boll weevil and cotton boll and cotton budworm problems. So we also showed that resistant management could be used to maximize the lifetime of the chemical and prevent resistance development. So integrated pest management was a concept that was born then and has become the standard for managing pests. Well, what have GMO plants brought to agriculture? Well, they brought this brand new technology, the ability to change genetically plants as well as animals. And they brought with this a combination of genetically modified plants with the genes for a specific toxin that is specific for a given insect pest, along with the abilities to sustain larger amounts of the herbicide glyphosate. The problem is that 96% of that material of the seed does not go into the plant. It's free to go into the environment and go other places. The Center for Food Science has a new neonicotinoid in the water systems of the United States report just out this past month. It's a wonderful report that documents the latest results of neonicotinoid levels in water systems in California, in Iowa, and in Maryland, where studies have been done. By using a systemic pesticide, or any pesticide with a single mode of action, and making it available all season long, as it is in a systemic material inside of a plant and expressed in pollen and nectar, or in the case of this, resistance for expression for tolerance in the plant for the herbicide, it's the ideal way, as Randy told us this morning, of selecting for resistance. You use either a high dose that selects 95% of the population, you get a rapid change, or you do it over a long period of time, you get elimination of all those susceptible individuals. So you cause the population to change in response to your chemical pressure in the shortest possible time. Glyphosate continual use has led to resistance development. In fact, now all 16 major weed species in corn and soybean production are resistant to glyphosate. And the chemical industry's answer to this is, well, switch to another herbicide. That's what entomologists long ago dubbed the chemical treadmill. We already know that that is not a sustainable solution to the problem. The extent of environmental costs of this approach is really currently unknown. And I would say that glyphosate sales have doubled in the last 10 years. And I think it's worth asking the question, who's benefited from this? And who's paying? And who's going to pay for the consequences? How do we know how well we're doing in our food system? Well, in 1970, following Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, the EPA was created. When DDT was banned, it was found in the fatty tissue and in mother's milk throughout the United States population. In 2014, a survey of 1,600 publications on glyphosate concludes that it is the most biologically disruptive chemical in our environment. Failure to monitor the environment for chemicals does not mean that they're absent and exerting no impact. It simply means you're living in ignorance. How can anyone claim to have a rational chemical regulation and safety approach if no one knows how many chemicals of what kinds or frequency or distribution they are in the environment? This is simply an unacceptable situation, not only as a scientist, but as a citizen. What's important in the politics of pesticide public policy? Well, we'd like to have the translation of science and what it understands translated into public policy that prevents undue risk to people and the environment from chemical usage. We know that chemicals can fulfill a very necessary and helpful role if used properly. We'd like to have public policy that monitors and reacts aggressively to misuse of chemicals, to infractions of specified use and unintended impacts. We really need a policy that argues for, and this is what makes it so difficult and contentious, that argues for the conflicting values of those making and using pesticides to be balanced with those impacted by them. That's why public policy making is so difficult. We'd like to have a sustainable system that manages risks according to the best interests of society. And there are many, many examples of a law that was written very carefully and worded a specific way, and once it was implemented, had the exact opposite impact of what was intended because of the vagaries of our English language. Well, that's only part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that when I was in Washington as a Kellogg Fellow, I learned about the iron triangle of power in Washington. And this is the real way decisions are made. Okay, you have a political interest group, a PAC, that gives money to help elect a congressperson to their office. Well, that's a really favorable thing, and so the congressman can pass favorable laws for that interest group. And they can give agencies of the executive, such as the EPA or the FDA or others that are involved in regulation, direction and strong advice about how to help keep this interest group happy. And so the agency of the executive passes rules or doesn't pass rules that are favorable to the interest group, and on it goes. This is the functional way that things get done in Washington. Here's the next book I would recommend that everyone in this room read. It was called Poison Spring. And it's written by a 25-year EPA employee who reveals the history of compromised regulatory decisions favoring the chemical industry based on his lifetime experience in the Environmental Protection Agency. Not only was he in the EPA, but he's in the Office of Pesticide Programs that deals with pesticide approval specifically. And he cites example after example since the 1970s of EPA decisions that are contrary to what the panel of scientists recommended. Most recently, this 2014 paper by Cahn et al. That's co-authored by scientists who were on the EPA advisory panels talks about the EPA decisions on atrazine that were counter to 3 separate panels of scientists and their recommendations to EPA about what they should do about atrazine. EPA did the opposite in every case. Since I became advisor to the National Honeybee Advisory Board, we've been knocking on the door of EPA. We've had numerous meetings, and one of the things that we learned as a consequence of those meetings was that conditional registration of a pesticide is a tool available for emergency situations. It's meant to give quick registration to a chemical where there's an urgent need in the agricultural system for the ability to control some pest, something other than varroa, for instance. Okay, so conditional registration will do that, and it will give permission to sell that product before all of the data that's necessary to evaluate the true risk of the material through its own stated standards before that is satisfied. But what we found out was that 70% of EPA decisions about registering pesticides were conditional. Not only that, they were conditional with no specified time period of when the rest of the data had to be submitted. Not only that, but for neonicotinoids, 14 years after conditional registration, the rest of the data wasn't there. Pretty shocking. Well, you talk to the EPA folks and they say, well, if we make a mistake, incident reporting at the state level will let us know we've made a mistake, and this is the feedback in the system that will let us make adjustments. As it turns out, the incident reporting system in the state level, is broken. It's an unfunded mandate. There is no money in the state budget to deal with investigations and reporting of misuse of pesticides, and so it's fallen by the wayside. And the National Honeybee Advisory Board has really been hammering on EPA about the label language and changing that language in a meaningful way And we've finally been able to make some progress, but I can tell you the first meeting we had, where we got to a high-level EPA administrator, and we started mentioning label language, that's off the table. We can't even talk about it. That's so difficult. It's so hard to get to there, we're not even going to discuss it. Well, after the Beekeepers got on the EPA stakeholder committee, guess what? A subcommittee dealing with label language was formed, and it's been hammering away at that ever since. Finally, as a scientist, I find the fact that the entire registration risk assessment process, the way the scientific data that's generated, is not open to scientific or public scrutiny of any kind. It's considered proprietary information between the registrants and EPA. I spent 2.5 years, maybe 3 years of my life involved in this Pollinator Risk Assessment International Congress that was put on jointly between the EPA and the ag chem industry. And we worked very hard to get equal representation among scientists, among government, among academia, among chemical companies from the European Union, from Canada, from the United States, and from other countries that wanted to participate, to try to come together and say, how can we improve the risk assessment process for evaluating potential pesticides and their impact on pollinators. And I was co-chair of one of the sections that dealt with laboratory testing and sublethal impacts of pesticides. And from that, finally came this book, Pesticide Risk Assessment for Pollinators, where a separate tier testing system for systemic pesticides was added. So that was not part of the process when neonicotinoids were approved, but it's now going to become part of the process. They added adult bee chronic toxicity to the adult bee acute toxicity. They've added larval feeding toxicity to the testing procedure, which has never been there and really needs to be. They've added the idea that we should have multiple native species of pollinators evaluated when a chemical is first looked at. That's a really good thing, and the list of native species can differ by country, so it's adaptable around the world. And yet sublethal impacts, formulation ingredients, and combinations of chemicals are off the list. The most common things that are always there, simply not on the list. So I would say that my experience, and I really did start out with an honest, open mind about, I can't think of a more difficult job as a scientist than being an EPA scientist for my career. I really did have an open mind about the difficulties and the forces that they deal with. And yet I would say that given this book, Poison Spring, and the history of the experiences we've encountered, EPA is there to slow down the decision-making process in a way that's favorable to the registrants and not to anybody else. That's their documented history for the last 30 years. They say we're willing to make changes, but the rate at which we make change is so slow that it's completely ineffective. Well, pesticides and public policy. How can we make a change? Well, I was a Kellogg Fellow at the National Center for Food and Ag Policy for 6 weeks when I was a new department head at Penn State. And this was a group of people from across the food system brought to Washington to look at how the policy-making process in the food system works. And I have to tell you, I was overwhelmed by how little science impacts the process. It was incredibly disappointing for me as a scientist to see this. The discussion is all about the economic consequences, where the environmental consequences and the lifestyle of people engaged in agriculture is not part of the discussion. And what I realized was that for the congressional people and their staffers, 99% of them are either economists or lawyers. They aren't even trained in science. They don't even talk about, I was told we don't even talk about science in agriculture until once every 5 years when the Farm Bill comes up, and then we have to be bothered with it. Well, how do you impact public policy? Here's what I learned. The larger the voter base, the larger the voice. You have to make an economically justified case. The way to do this effectively in Washington is coalitions around common goals have been the norm for ag and environmental issues. Those other groups that are conservation minded, want to protect the birds, want to protect the environment, want to protect aquatic systems, want to protect fish, pheasants forever. Those are all the people who understand the negative consequences of pollution in the environment. Those are the people you need to partner with. And many of them have had a long time presence in Washington and know people and know how to work the system. You have to effectively lobby the process and make changes in laws, or you've got to sue, force a change. Partnering with organizations that have this experience in DC makes great sense. You can go the other way and garner public support from the ground up, and this will short circuit the power of the triangle of power in Washington, but it's a difficult thing to do. But what did Mothers Against Drunk Driving do? Against all possible odds, they changed the laws about drunk driving in the United States, didn't they? Well, it just so happens that there is another example of this that I'll get to in a moment. But what is the economic case for the bee crisis? This is really interesting. Turns out bees are the third most important animal in the American food system in terms of total dollar value. Cattle are number 1, hogs are number 2, bees are number 3, poultry is number 4. Okay, and I learned this from a bear scientist. It was really interesting. Pollination is an essential component of our food system that contributes somewhere between $15 and $20 billion annually to the American food system. Based on fairly reliable evidence of the apiary inspectors, 5.6 million colonies lost since 2006 have resulted in a cost of $1.12 billion to beekeepers to replace those colonies, largely without any government support. I consider that completely unacceptable. One of our commercial beekeepers said, what happens if I lose 200 colonies in almond pollination and I can't use them on the other 5 crops that I normally do? He went to those growers, said, if you didn't have 200 colonies pollinating your crop, what would that mean to you economically? Turns out 200 colonies across 5 crops in the eastern U.S. would result in a loss of $4.8 million to those growers. There's a real multiplication effect of losing bee colonies. Resources to replace about a third of the honeybee colonies every year for the last 6 years have really depleted what the beekeepers have been trying to do, largely without any government recognition. And will the pollination demands exceed supply next year? This is a very real question we've been asking for several years. And if it weren't for the water situation taking almonds out of production, we probably would have gotten a very different answer to this. Well, how well do we know? How well we're doing? Well, the pesticide regulatory actions are in critical need of revision. Political influences currently favor those with the most money and thus the loudest voice. The National Honeybee Advisory Board has given incredible amounts of their time and energy and their resources to try to impact pesticide policy and legislation in the United States, and they have gained seats at the table where your voices can be heard. But they need your help to make that voice louder. Coalitions with others who support conservation and clean environments are an absolute necessity. And regardless of the iron triangle of power in Washington, these voices can short-circuit that. Public outcry can change everything. I ran across this blog from the Huffington Post as I was preparing this talk for early January. 2 groups, Moms to EPA, Recall Monsanto's Roundup. 2 organizations here in California, Mothers Across America and Thinking Moms Revolution, contacted the EPA and wanted a face-to-face meeting. They were told, forget it. They came home, and in 3 days, they garnered their telephone tree to produce 10,000 calls to the EPA. And you know what? 2 weeks later, they had a face-to-face meeting. They presented data to the EPA about unsafe levels of glyphosate in their drinking water, in their own breast milk, and in their children's urine. And they gave first-hand documentation of multiple testimonies of how changing their children to completely organic diets eliminated the symptoms that their children had of gastrointestinal disorders, autoimmune conditions, anxiety and depression, and so forth. And they left a stack of scientific studies for EPA to consider. In addition to that, I ran across these recent studies. In preparing documentation for the Scottish government, this fellow Mason had a report called Glyphosate, Destructor of Human Health and Biodiversity, submitted to the Scottish government. High significant correlations with glyphosate use on corn and soybeans in the U.S. and the incidence and prevalence of obesity, type 2 diabetes, autism, Alzheimer's, thyroid and liver cancers, and more, documented in this report. The European Food Safety Authority, which has the same role as EPA here, has changed from a 90-day feeding study to evaluate to a 2-year. And as you probably have heard, this past year they've upgraded the classification of glyphosate as a possible carcinogen based on a review of scientific literature. A 2013 paper called Glyphosate Suppression of Cytochrome P450, one of the major detoxification genes, and the gut microbiome pathways to modern diseases. They state in the summary of this paper, exhaustive literature, glyphosate is likely pervasive in our food supply and contrary to being essentially non-toxic, may in fact be the most biologically disruptive chemical in our environment. And then finally, even greater concern is this 2013 paper, Glyphosate Induces Human Breast Cancer Cell Growth via Estrogen Receptors. And so here is a defined laboratory study showing that glyphosate can be an endocrine disruptor, meaning that in general its potency goes from parts per billion to parts per trillion. The most important agent of change is the educated consumer. You vote for change in the food system or for no change every time you purchase food or every time you eat out. The collective economic consequences of these choices cannot be ignored. That's what the organic proponents have been doing for 20 years. So, are dying bees harbingers of the end times, or are they an opportunity to make change? I would submit to you, in my 45 years of hindsight, that they're both. That environmental loads of chemicals are far beyond our current realization, and this must be changed. Not only for our bees, but for ourselves and our loved ones. The health consequences are critical. There's already enough information out there to know that this is a one-to-one correspondence between chemical load and our health. Our food system paradigm needs a shift. Our regulatory system needs major improvements. Opportunities are many to change things for ourselves and for our grandchildren. The only question that remains, are you in? I hope I've convinced you that you should lend your voice for change in whatever direction you feel it should be made. And I hope that when it comes to spending your food dollar, you'll spend it often and spend it wisely. Thank you for listening.